People in the Middle Ages experienced altered states of consciousness. These experiences came through substances that were part of ordinary life. The substances were fermented beverages, medicinal herbs, and plants used in religious contexts. The experiences were not considered unusual. They were woven into the fabric of daily existence. They were not separated from normal life, but were part of it. The most common experience of intoxication came from alcohol. Alcohol was consumed regularly by most people. It was not consumed for the purpose of intoxication, though intoxication sometimes resulted. It was consumed because it was safer than water. Water sources were often contaminated. Wells could be polluted. Streams carried waste. Drinking water directly was risky. Drinking fermented beverages was safer. The fermentation process killed many harmful organisms. Therefore, people drank ale, beer, wine, and mead as their primary beverages. Ale was the common drink in Northern Europe. It was made from barley or other grains. It was brewed in individual households. The brewing was usually done by women. It was a regular household task, like baking bread or spinning wool. The ale that resulted was weak by modern standards. It contained perhaps 2 or 3% alcohol. This was enough to make it safer than water, but not enough to cause strong intoxication from normal consumption. People drank this weak ale throughout the day. They drank it at breakfast. They drank it at midday. They drank it in the evening. They drank it when they were thirsty. The constant low-level consumption meant that many people maintained a slight state of intoxication most of the time. This state was mild. It was barely noticeable. It was simply normal. People were accustomed to it. They functioned normally while in this state. Stronger ale existed. It was brewed for special occasions. Festivals, weddings, holy days. This stronger ale might contain 5 or 6% alcohol. When people drank this stronger ale, they felt its effects more clearly. They became more relaxed. Their speech became looser. Their movements became less precise. Their mood became elevated. These effects were familiar. They were expected. They were part of celebration. Wine was consumed in southern Europe and among wealthier people in the north. Wine was made from grapes. It was stronger than weak ale. It contained perhaps 10 to 12% alcohol. Wine was expensive. Most people could not afford to drink it regularly, but those who could drink it did so. They drank it with meals. They drank it in the evening. The effects were similar to those of strong ale, but came on more quickly because the alcohol content was higher. Mead was made from fermented honey. It was sweet. It was strong. It was consumed on special occasions. Mead had significance in northern cultures. It was associated with celebration and with sacred occasions. Drinking mead produced a warm feeling. It produced relaxation. It produced mild euphoria. These effects were valued. Mead was shared among companions. The sharing created bonds. The experience of being drunk was known to everyone. Drunkenness occurred at festivals. It occurred at feasts. It occurred in taverns. People who drank too much became loud. They became unsteady. They became foolish. This was observed and remarked upon. Drunkenness was not admired, but neither was it rare. It was a predictable result of celebration and abundance. The church had complex views on intoxication from alcohol. Moderate drinking was acceptable. Wine was used in the Mass. It represented the blood of Christ. Drinking wine was therefore sanctified. But excessive drinking was sinful. It was the sin of gluttony. It impaired reason. it led to other sins. The boundary between acceptable drinking and sinful drinking was somewhat flexible. Priests drank, monks brewed beer and made wine, but they were supposed to drink in moderation. Beyond alcohol, other substances produced altered states. These were primarily medicinal herbs and plants. Medicine in the Middle Ages was based on the theory of humours. The body contained 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness resulted from imbalance in these humours. Treatment aimed to restore balance. Many treatments involved substances that had strong effects on the mind and body. Opium was known and used. It came from the opium poppy. The poppy grew in various regions. Its properties were documented in medical texts. Opium was used to relieve pain. It was used to help people sleep. It was used to treat coughing. When someone consumed opium, they felt their pain diminish. They felt drowsiness. They felt a sense of detachment from their body. These effects were useful for someone suffering from illness or injury. Opium was administered as a liquid preparation or as a small amount of the dried substance. The dosage was not precise. Medical knowledge was limited. Sometimes the amount given was too large. The person became deeply sedated. They might sleep for many hours. They might seem almost unconscious. This was not considered ideal, but neither was it considered catastrophic. The person would eventually wake. The sleep, even if unnaturally deep, was thought to be healing. Mandrake was another plant with strong effects. Mandrake root was used as a painkiller and sedative. It contained compounds that affected the nervous system. When someone consumed mandrake, they became drowsy. They felt disconnected from their surroundings. They sometimes experienced visions or strange dreams. These effects made mandrake useful before surgery or during painful medical procedures. Mandrake had a reputation for being magical. The root sometimes resembled a human form. Legends grew around it. It was said to scream when pulled from the ground. It was said to be guarded by demons. These beliefs increased its mystique. But for physicians, it was simply a powerful medicine. They used it for practical purposes. The visions and dreams it caused were side effects, noted, but not the primary purpose. Henbane was used similarly. It caused sedation and hallucinations. It was given to people in pain. It was given to people who needed to be kept still during treatment. The hallucinations were sometimes frightening. People saw things that were not there. They heard voices. They felt presences. These experiences were understood to be effects of the plant. They were not considered real. They were temporary disturbances that would pass. Hemlock was known as a poison, but in small doses it had medicinal uses. It reduced pain. It caused a numbing sensation. It made the limbs feel heavy. In larger doses, it caused paralysis and death. Physicians knew this and were cautious. But the line between a medicinal dose and a dangerous dose was not always clear. Sometimes people received too much. The consequences could be serious. But when used correctly, hemlock served a purpose. These medicinal plants were administered by physicians, by apothecaries, by wise women, by monks who tended the sick. The knowledge of their use was passed down through texts and through practical training. The substances were not used recreationally. They were used when someone needed pain relief or sedation. but the altered states they produced were real and were experienced by those who received them. Ergot was a fungus that grew on rye. When rye contaminated with ergot was ground into flour and baked into bread, people who ate the bread became ill. They experienced a condition called ergotism, or Saint Anthony's fire. The symptoms included burning sensations in the limbs, convulsions, and hallucinations. People saw visions. They felt their skin crawling. They experienced intense fear. Ergotism was not intentional. It was the result of contaminated grain. It occurred in years when weather conditions favored the growth of the fungus. Outbreaks affected entire villages. The experience was terrifying. People did not understand the cause. They attributed it to curses or divine punishment. The visions and altered perceptions were not sought. They were suffered. Some historians have suggested that ergotism might explain certain reports of mass visions or strange behavior in medieval communities. This is possible, but not certain. The connection between ergot and hallucinations was not understood in the Middle Ages. It would not be understood for many centuries. But the experiences were real. People lived through them. Alcohol combined with herbs sometimes produced enhanced effects. Wine might be infused with herbs. Ale might be flavored with plants that had mild psychoactive properties. These beverages were consumed without full awareness of their combined effects. The herbs added flavor. They also added subtle alterations to consciousness. The drinker felt relaxed, perhaps unusually so. They felt warm. They felt content. The effects were attributed to the wine or ale alone. Religious experiences sometimes involved altered states of consciousness. These states were achieved through fasting, through prayer, through physical deprivation. Mystics sought union with God. They fasted for extended periods. They slept little. They prayed for hours. These practices affected the body and mind. People in such states reported visions. They reported hearing divine voices. They reported feeling the presence of God or of angels. These visions were considered genuine spiritual experiences. They were not attributed to the physical state of the person. But the physical state certainly contributed. A body deprived of food and sleep enters altered states. The mind becomes more susceptible to unusual perceptions. The visions that came were interpreted as divine communications. They were valued and recorded. Incense was used in religious ceremonies. The smoke filled churches. It was made from resins and aromatic substances. Some of these substances, when burned, released compounds that had mild psychoactive effects. People breathing the incense for extended periods during long services might feel lightheaded. They might feel a sense of elevation. They might feel closer to the divine. These feelings enhanced the religious experience. They made the sacred space feel more sacred. The use of incense was intentional, though its psychoactive properties may not have been fully understood. The smoke created atmosphere. It created a boundary between the ordinary world and the sacred space. The effects on consciousness reinforced this boundary. People entered the church and breathed the incense and felt themselves entering a different realm. This was part of the ritual structure. Sleep deprivation was common, not always intentional, but common nonetheless. People woke during the night for the watch. They rose early for work. During harvest, they worked long hours and slept little. Sleep deprivation produces its own altered state. The mind becomes unfocused. Perceptions change. Small hallucinations can occur. Things seen in peripheral vision seem to move. Sounds seem distorted. These experiences were part of life during demanding periods. Fever created altered states. Illness was common in the Middle Ages. When someone had a fever, they often became delirious. They spoke irrationally. They saw things that were not present. They lost track of time and place. These delirium states were frightening for the sick person and for those caring for them. But they were understood as part of illness. They would pass when the fever broke. Pain itself could alter consciousness. Severe pain consumed all attention. It narrowed the world to the immediate sensation. People in extreme pain sometimes reported feeling detached from their bodies. They watched their own suffering as if from a distance. This dissociation was a natural response to unbearable sensation. It was not induced by substances, but by the body's own mechanisms. Childbirth involved both pain and sometimes medicinal substances. Women in labour experienced intense physical sensation. They were sometimes given herbal preparations to ease pain or to speed labour. These preparations might contain substances that affected consciousness. A woman in labour, especially prolonged labour, might enter a state where she was only partially aware of her surroundings. She was focused inward, on the overwhelming physical process. The boundary between normal consciousness and altered consciousness became unclear. Dancers and musicians sometimes achieved altered states through their activities. Prolonged dancing, especially the ecstatic dancing that occurred at some festivals, produced exhaustion and euphoria. The repetitive movement, the music, the company of others, all combined to create a state different from ordinary waking consciousness. Dancers felt transported. They felt released from daily concerns. They felt joy that was almost transcendent. These states were temporary. They ended when the dancing ended. But while they lasted, they were real. Travelling players and performers sometimes use substances to enhance their performances or to endure discomfort. A performer might drink strong ale before a performance to calm nerves. A juggler might use a preparation that sharpened focus. These uses were practical. They served a professional purpose. But they also produced altered perceptions and feelings. Soldiers before battle sometimes drank heavily. This was done to numb fear. The alcohol did not make them braver, but it made them less aware of danger. It reduced their inhibitions. It allowed them to charge into situations they might otherwise avoid. Commanders sometimes provided ale or wine to their troops before engagement. The effect was predictable and useful, though it also impaired judgment and coordination. The experience of these various altered states was accepted as part of life. People did not analyze them in the way they might be analyzed now. They did not speak of being high or getting intoxicated as separate categories of experience. They simply experienced the effects of what they consumed or what they did. The effects were noticeable, but were not usually dramatic. Life continued. Work continued. The altered state was temporary. It passed. Normal consciousness returned. There was no clear distinction between medicinal use and what might now be called recreational use. When someone drank ale, they drank it as a beverage and experienced its mild effects. When someone took a medicinal herb, they took it for an ailment and experienced its effects, which might include altered consciousness. The purpose determined the context, but the experience was the experience. Social drinking occurred in taverns and in homes. People gathered to drink together. The drinking was social activity. It facilitated conversation. It lowered barriers between people. It created fellowship. As people drank, they became more animated. They talked more freely. They laughed more easily. These effects were valued. They made social life more pleasant. They created bonds between members of a community. Feast days involved substantial drinking. The church calendar included many feast days. These were days of celebration. Work stopped. People attended services. Then they gathered to eat and drink. The drinking was generous. Strong ale or wine was provided. People drank until they felt the effects clearly. This was acceptable on feast days. It was part of the celebration. The next day, people returned to sobriety and to work. Excessive drinking was noted and sometimes criticized. Someone who drank too much too often gained a reputation. They might be called a drunkard. This was not a term of approval. But neither did it carry the moral weight it might carry now. It was an observation. Some people drank excessively. This was known. They were still part of the community. Their failing was noted, but they were not excluded. Women who drank excessively were judged more harshly than men. This was part of the broader pattern of stricter moral expectations for women. A drunk woman was seen as having failed more completely than a drunk man. She had lost control in a way that was considered particularly unseemly. But even so, women drank. Women became drunk. The judgment did not prevent the behavior. The morning after heavy drinking was unpleasant. People woke with headaches. They felt nauseous. They felt weak. This was understood as the consequence of excess. There were folk remedies for these symptoms. People might drink water with herbs. They might eat certain foods. The remedies may or may not have helped. Regardless, the discomfort passed with time. By evening, the person felt better. Life resumed. Long-term effects of heavy drinking were observed, but not well understood. Someone who drank heavily for years might develop a swollen belly. They might develop tremors. They might become forgetful or confused. These effects were seen but not clearly connected to drinking. Medical understanding was limited. The connection between chronic alcohol consumption and organ damage was not known. The substances that altered consciousness were integrated into daily life. They were not hidden. They were not forbidden. With some exceptions, they were simply present. People used them according to custom and need. The experiences they produced were familiar experiences. They were not considered extraordinary. They were part of the range of human experience. Children sometimes experienced these altered states. Children drank weak ale because water was unsafe. They felt its mild effects. Children who were ill received medicinal preparations. They experienced the effects of those medicines. Children participated in feast day celebrations. They observed adults drinking. Sometimes they drank themselves in smaller amounts. They learned about intoxication through exposure and observation. Old people continued drinking as they had throughout their lives. An old person might drink ale or wine daily. If they were in pain, they might receive opium or other strong medicines. These medicines made their final days more bearable. They dulled pain. They induced sleep. They created a buffer between the suffering body and the conscious mind. This was considered merciful. The dying sometimes received preparations that eased their passage. These might include opium or other sedating substances. The purpose was to reduce suffering. The person would slip into unconsciousness. Death would come more gently. This was accepted as proper care for the dying. Prolonging consciousness, when the body was failing, served no purpose. Better to allow peace. The experience of altered consciousness in the Middle Ages was thus woven throughout life. It came with the daily cup of ale. It came with medicinal herbs when needed. It came with religious practice. It came with celebration. It came with illness. It came with dying. The states themselves varied from very mild to quite profound, but all were part of the texture of medieval experience. These states were not pursued for their own sake in the way they might be pursued in other times and places. They were byproducts of other activities. They were consequences of treating illness. They were aspects of social life. They occurred and were noted and then passed. Life continued in its patterns. The altered state was a moment, sometimes pleasant, sometimes useful, sometimes unavoidable. Then it ended. Consciousness returned to its ordinary mode. People in the Middle Ages did not have the language to describe these experiences in the way they might be described now. They did not speak of neurochemistry or receptors or altered brain states. They spoke in terms they knew. They spoke of spirits, of humours, of divine influences. But the experiences themselves were real. The substances affected the body and mind in predictable ways. The effects were felt. The ordinariness of these experiences is perhaps their most notable feature. They were not exotic. They were not pursued as escapes from reality. They were simply part of reality. When someone drank ale, they felt its effects. When someone took medicine, they felt its effects. The effects were acknowledged and accepted. Then the moment passed, and ordinary life resumed. This was what experiencing altered consciousness was like in medieval times. It was common. It was varied. It was integrated into daily life. It came through substances that were familiar and available. It came through practices that were part of culture. It was neither hidden nor celebrated. It simply was. People lived with it. They experienced it. They moved on. This concludes the narration.